Hello, Derek and Paul. I'm glad to say hello to you today. Derek and I were talking about how resurrection faith was born, not the empty tomb and not all the accounts in the Gospels per se, but what do we know historically about how followers of Jesus came to believe that he was raised from the dead? And what I suggested to Derek, and he asked me just to briefly present this, is you start with our earliest source, and it happens to be our only eyewitness source. None of the accounts in the four synoptic or John, the Gospels in the New Testament, synoptic or John, are eyewitness. In other words, it depends on who wrote those books, and they've been redacted and edited and so forth. But we do have letters from Paul. In one particular letter, he mentions Jesus' resurrection in a number of places, but is 1 Corinthians. And there he says that in chapter 9, I have seen the Lord, referring to Jesus, after he's dead. I've seen him. I've had this visionary experience. And then in chapter 15 of the same letter, he talks about how Jesus did. He was cited by, is the way I would translate it. There were sightings of Jesus by first Peter, and then James, and then the 12, and then to 500, and all the disciples. And he goes, and last of all, he appeared to me. I had the appearance. Now, the nature of these appearances in the Gospels are quite different, except for in Mark. But let me stay with Paul just for a minute. According to Paul, he can't tell you what kind of a body he saw Jesus in, but he does say that at Jesus' heavenly return, the parousia, or second coming, as Christians later call it, that those raised from the dead will be transformed into a body like Jesus has. And he does say it was glorious, it's immortal, it's powerful. He says it's not flesh and blood. So his experience, his vision, his apparition, you might say, what he perceived, he likens to what the disciples perceive. So I would start there because that, he says, eyewitness, first person, I have seen the Lord. Now, all the other accounts are secondary, but if you go to the earliest account in the Gospels, that would be Mark chapter 16. And there you have something pretty interesting. And that is that the women come to the tomb early Sunday morning, Easter morning, as it later gets called. And the body's not there, but there's a person in the tomb, a young man, he's called. And he says to the women, he's not here. And he doesn't say he's been resurrected from the dead. What he says is he's been lifted up. He's been lifted up. This is the term we use for what's called apotheosis. He's been taken up to the heavens. And then the messenger, the guy that's there, says, he will see you in Galilee. And there's an earlier passage where Jesus talks about, after my crucifixion, I'll see you in Galilee. Now, whether Jesus said that or not is irrelevant. The point is they have this memory of seeing Jesus in Galilee. Now, Paul wasn't in Galilee, but he wasn't the first witness. He was the last. So if we go to the first witness, according to Paul, it was Peter. And then we have another text. It's a very important text, the Gospel of Peter. It breaks off at the end where Peter says, I'm going fishing, but it's 8 days after Passover where he says we mourned and wept. So the early tradition is that the disciples went back to the Galilee. The Gospel of Peter even says they were mourning. Why would they be mourning if they'd been hanging out with Jesus for a week? And so those accounts, I think, are later. So what happens? They go back fishing, and Peter saw something. What he saw, we don't know, but we would assume that it's something like Paul saw, some sort of apparition, presumably in the sky or something of that sort. And I think that is our earliest view. Matthew confirms that because he says it's on a mountain in the Galilee. This is in Matthew 28. And the 11 apostles have this experience, But he adds, very amazingly, but some doubted. So whatever they were seeing, this visionary experience, it was glorious, it was powerful, it was amazing, probably like the transfiguration account in Mark 9. But whatever it was, how many? Some doubted. Did 5, 6, 7 of the 11 doubt and think, well, I'm not sure it's him. Anyway, as it's later told, they all saw him. And then there was a mass apotheosis and revelation of Jesus to this group of 500 that we don't know anything about. But that would be my take on it. I think you have to start with the Galilee, with some sort of visionary experience. And what that entailed, all I know is what's reported, that people had these sightings, but it's not the flesh and blood running around Jerusalem looking at wounds. It's not that kind of thing. That's not the birth of resurrection faith. It's a body that you can't even describe. You would think of it maybe as a bright light and a voice or something of that sort.